Hi there, you're listening to the Hellenistic Age Podcast, Episode 114, The Nabataean Kingdom. One early morning in April of 2025, I found myself walking through a winding canyon known as al-Suk near the town of Wadi Musa in southern Jordan. Only occasionally interrupted by the echoing shrieks of birds of prey, I was fortunate enough to trek in silence and escape the mob of tourists, while also taking in the trace remains of ancient sculptures and graffiti carved into the walls. Soon enough, a glow pierced my path, and upon reaching its end, I found myself in front of an awe-inspiring sight. An enormous tomb, ornately carved out of the sandstone that glowed a radiant rose-orange in the sunlight, measuring nearly 39 meters or 129 feet in height, decorated with equally large Corinthian columns and flanked by faceless robed figures leading their larger-than-life horses. Known in Arabic as al-Khazneh, the Treasury, this is the most famous monument of the City of Petra, royal capital of the Nabataean Kingdom that once ruled across much of the Levant from the 3rd century BC until the early 2nd century AD. In this episode, we will cover the history of the Nabataeans, their society, their place within the Mediterranean, and a detailed description of their capital city of Petra. Like so many cultures we cover, no known history of the Nabataeans written by the Nabataeans themselves survives. We instead are informed by Greek and Jewish authors, but with the former we have a peculiar situation where Nabataean society is particularly visible during the time just after Alexander the Great, and once again just before Augustus, nearly 3 centuries apart from one another. The earliest account comes from Diodorus of Sicily in the mid-1st century BC, who was relying on the writings of Hieronymus of Cardia, a prominent general turned historian serving in the employment of Antigonus I Monophthalmus in the late 4th century. The second is the geographer Strabo, calling upon the eyewitness testimony of his friend Athenodorus of Tarsus, who visited Petra in 60 BC at the near height of its power. The pictures painted by both authors are radically different, with one suggesting a nomadic society, while the other an established sedentary kingdom. But the accounts themselves are not contradictory, and instead indicate how Nabataean culture adapted throughout the Hellenistic and early Roman period. We are supplemented by the writings of the Jewish author Josephus, in which the Nabataeans feature given their proximity to Judea and dealings with the Hasmonean and Herodian dynasty. Supplementary accounts come from Hellenistic writers like Agatharchides of Cnidus and Theophrastus, but also by later Romans like Pliny the Elder and the anonymous author of the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, all of whom were particularly interested in the economic role the Nabataeans held and what goods they had to trade. Geographically speaking, the heartland of the Nabataeans is found mainly in the modern Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan and northwestern Saudi Arabia, particularly in the region known as the Hejaz that extends southeast from the Transjordan down along the Red Sea coastline. At its maximum limits, the borders of the kingdom stretch to include the Sinai Peninsula and southern Syria in the Hauran. This made it a strong regional player in the post-Seleucid Levant, competing against neighboring communities like the Hasmonean and Herodian kingdoms in Judea or the Greek cities of the Decapolis in the north. The climate can range from arid scrub to desert, marked by a few well-watered areas. The further south and into the interior of Arabia you go, the harsher it becomes, and the importance of the Nabataean settlements to act as oases for travelers within the region becomes readily apparent. Both the Greeks and Romans refer to the peoples living within the Arabian Peninsula broadly as Arabs, but the Nabataeans themselves never actually describe themselves as such in any of their inscriptions. Their society, especially in this earlier stage, would have been based on tribal affiliations and kinship, and we may have a similar situation as the grouping of the Celtic peoples of Europe. The Nabataeans spoke a variety of different languages, and while we lack any literary works by them, their existence is attested to by the many thousands of surviving inscriptions that can be found throughout the Levant and Middle East, mostly in the form of signatures, giving names and clan affiliations. The earliest known is Aramaic, the lingua franca of the ancient Near East that probably was a carryover of centuries of rule by the Persian Empire. Diodorus of Sicily reports that the Nabataeans of the 4th century BC wrote in Syrian letters, but in context this is meant to be Aramaic. The actual spoken language of Nabataean is part of the Semitic family and closely related to Old Arabic, but varied widely in its use across the Near East. Its script was developed by the early 1st century BC, and based on the Aramaic one, and it continued to influence the development of later Arabic alphabets. Through their encounters with the Hellenistic kingdoms, Koine Greek gradually became another tongue used in Nabataean society, largely for commercial purposes, but also can be found in inscriptions as well. Though it seems that they largely avoided the Macedonian invasion in Alexander's time, the Nabataeans came to the attention of the Hellenistic kingdoms during the Wars of the Successors. In 311, Antigonus I Monophthalmus ordered that his commander Athenias lead an expedition against the Nabataeans to seize their goods and livestock. Equipped with 4,000 cavalry and 600 infantry, they marched from Idumea southwards towards their home base. This encounter was presumably recorded by Hieronymus of Cardia, and his account formed the basis in much of Diodorus's work on this period. Hieronymus insists that at this time, the Nabataeans were strictly a nomadic society, raising livestock in the desert, and while certainly the largest and wealthiest of the Arab tribes that they knew of, he insists that any attempts to form permanent settled communities were forbidden on the punishment of death. The closest thing resembling a capital was a location that the Greeks did not have a name for, simply calling it the Rock, which in Greek is Petra. When they held their tribal assembly, the men placed their women, children, and elderly here for safekeeping, given its natural protection and relative abundance of water supplies. During one of these assemblies, Athenias and his troops raided Petra during a night attack, killing and enslaving much of the inhabitants before racing off with their plunder in tow. In his hubris, Athenias foolishly chose to encamp rather than continue his march, believing that they still had plenty of time to escape. The following night proved him wrong, when 8,000 angry Nabataean riders descended upon the sleeping Greeks and slaughtered most of them, with only 50 heavily wounded cavalrymen surviving to tell the tale. A letter soon arrived in the camp of Antigonus, written in Aramaic, from the leading Nabataeans asking for an explanation behind the attack. Monophthalmus played dumb, claiming that Athenias was operating independently against his wishes, and stressed his friendship towards them. Though they accepted the explanation, they remained cautious, as the Arab communities posted guards on their borders to keep on the lookout for any future attacks. This vigilance was rewarded when Antigonus charged his son Demetrius Polyarchides with avenging the defeat inflicted earlier, arming him with 4,000 light infantry and 4,000 cavalry and several days' worth of supplies. The goal was to maintain speed above all else and have the element of surprise on their side. But the Nabataean patrols caught wind of the Greeks' movement in Petra's direction. Its surviving populace and livestock were scattered to the countryside, while the men fortified themselves in the heights of the rock formations. Frustrated at having been caught, Demetrius attempted to lay siege to the defenders, but was unsuccessful in doing so. Negotiations were soon arranged, with the Nabataeans making a long speech about their desire for freedom and offering gifts to establish a stronger friendship with Antigonus. But they also warned their Greek attackers that their water supplies were fast dwindling, and to press the siege would be unsustainable at this pace. Demetrius grimly understood his position, and so they struck an agreement, exchanging hostages and gifts in return for peace. Antigonus may not have been pleased at his son's failure to bring the Nabataeans to heel, but he had far more pressing matters to attend to with his other Macedonian rivals. Following the Antigonid adventure, the Nabataeans are largely silent in our sources for the next 130 years, but we do have scant references to them. A fragmentary epigram of the Ptolemaic court poet Posidippus of Pella in the early 3rd century mentions an unknown Nabataean ruler at the head of a powerful host of horsemen. Perhaps they were allied with the Ptolemies, given that Egypt controlled much of Coile Syria, which bordered on their kingdom. This is further alluded to by the papyri archive of the Ptolemaic financial minister Zenon, which refers to an incident involving the recruitment of Nabataeans as guards. The oldest coins found in Petra include large bronzes of Ptolemy II Philadelphus and the geographer Eratosthenes knew of the city's existence at the time of Ptolemy III. It is possible that the Nabataeans switched loyalties to the Seleucid Empire, as Polybius explains that Arab troops fought in the armies of Antiochus III during the Fourth Syrian War, but does not name them specifically. It is not until the mid-2nd century BC that we start to see the Nabataeans become more prominent within the political landscape of the Near East. This is largely due to the Jewish accounts of the Book of Maccabees and Josephus, who documented the rise of the Hasmonean dynasty by way of the Maccabean revolt in the 160s and 150s. Our first documented Nabataean ruler of any substance is Aretas I. Second Maccabees speaks of the disgraced high priest Jason fleeing to the court of Aretas in 168 to escape the wrath of Antiochus IV, where he apparently was accused by Aretas and briefly imprisoned. First Maccabees also indicates that both Judas and Jonathan encountered the Nabataeans on friendly terms after crossing the Jordan to campaign against the Greek cities of the north. Their involvement was probably no coincidence, for it seems that the Nabataeans had migrated further northwest into the region of the Negev around this time, which is attested to by the earliest known Nabataean inscription, found in the site of Elusa. Dated to the first half of the 2nd century BC, it suggests that the settlement's foundation was done so in the name of a king Aretas, presumably the same one that received Jason in 168. As the long 2nd century saw the whittling down of Seleucid power in the Levant, the Hasmonean dynasty rose as an aggressive power looking to expand their reach. This in turn would lead to problems between them and the Nabataeans, who were also becoming more influential. When King Alexander Jannaeus besieged Gaza in 100 BC, its citizens reached out to Aretas II for military aid, but were not given anything beyond moral support. By then, the economic links between the port city and Petra were firmly established, as were others throughout the wider Mediterranean. An earlier inscription dating to 129 BC from the city of Priene in Western Asia Minor honored one of its leading officials named Moskion, who had an adventurous career which included his role as an ambassador to Petra in Arabia. Given that Petra was listed on his itinerary among other prominent cities like Alexandria, it is a testament to how much stronger the Nabataean influence was in the latter half of the 2nd century. It is also no coincidence that it was Aretas II who ordered the striking of the first Nabataean coins, which showed Hellenistic designs such as Athena wearing a Corinthian-style helmet and the winged goddess Nike. While the affair in Gaza did not witness bloodshed, the same can't be said following the accession of Obodas I in 96. Shortly after he took the throne, a battle between him and Alexander Jannaeus in 94 near Gadara, modern Qais, nearly resulted in the high priest's death and contributed to an ongoing rebellion against his rule in Judea. To deal with the crisis, Alexander was forced to cede territory in Moab and Gilead to Obodas as a peace offering, which further expanded the reach of the Nabataeans bordering the city of Damascus. This was deeply concerning to the Seleucid king Antiochus XII, who ruled the pathetic remains of the dynasty's collapsing empire from the city and desired to reinforce his southern frontier against both the Hasmoneans and Nabataeans alike. Antiochus launched a first invasion against Arabia in the year 86, just after he took the throne, but failed and had to return to deal with rival claimants. 2 years later, he oversaw a more extensive campaign marching towards Petra to attack the Nabataean heartland directly. At first, Obodas appeared to be pushed back by an initial attack, but the Nabataean cavalry actually feigned a retreat, and thousands of horsemen descended upon the remains of the stunned Seleucid army, including Antiochus, who was killed in action in 83 BC. Never again would the Syrian dynasty threaten the Nabataeans, but Obodas himself seems to have died shortly after this battle, possibly due to sustained wounds from the fighting, and was replaced by his brother Aretas III. Now master of Damascus, Aretas issued the first Nabataean silver coins from that city's mint, and to legitimize himself in the eyes of his Greek subjects, he styled himself as a typical Hellenistic monarch, adopting the epithet Phil-Hellene and using the Greek language. This continued onwards until roughly 71 BC, when the Armenian king Tigranes II launched an invasion of Syria and seized Damascus. But the Nabataeans did not seem eager to retaliate. Coyly, Syria was in a state of flux, as the scramble for the dying remnants of the Seleucid realm coincided with troubles in Hasmonean Judea, since the death of Alexander Jannaeus resulted in a power struggle between his two sons, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, which led to the former seeking refuge in Petra after being ousted by his brother. Aretas involved himself by offering Hyrcanus his support, leading an army allegedly 50,000 strong and encircling Jerusalem in 65 BC. Though poised to install a loyal monarch on the throne of Judea, Aretas' actions led to the unwanted attention of another great power, the Roman Republic. Pompey Magnus was mopping up operations in Armenia and the rest of the Near East, and the Hasmonean crisis was well on his radar. In the autumn of 64, Pompey dispatched his commander Marcus Aemilius Scaurus to restore order in Judea, and Scaurus demanded that Aretas withdraw from Jerusalem, lest he face the wrath of the Republic. The Nabataeans quickly acquiesced to this order and allowed the Roman general to settle the civil war between the brothers. Having formally turned Syria into a Roman province and reorganized several of the Greek cities into the Decapolis, Pompey appointed Scaurus as his governor. It seems that Pompey had intended to probe the Nabataean Kingdom before he was drawn back into Hasmonean politicking, and eventually retired back to Rome, and the new governor took the liberty to launch an invasion into Arabia in 62. As already experienced by the Antigonid armies, the route to Petra proved treacherous, and supplies began to shrink as Scaurus tried to ravage the countryside. Besieging the capital itself was going to be even more difficult, but through the aid of one Antipater of Idumea, he managed to broker an agreement with Aretas, who promised to pay 300 talents of silver and pledge his friendship to the Romans in return for peace. To celebrate this victory, Scaurus struck commemorative coins that show Aretas kneeling in supplication with a palm frond in hand, symbolizing his submission to Rome, while Pompey listed Arabia among the many nations he brought to heel during the triumph celebrating his eastern campaigns. The Nabataeans entered into a new era, one marked by its role as a client kingdom beholden to the Roman Republic and eventually the Roman Empire starting under Augustus. Such was the same for the Hasmonean and later Herodian kingdom in Judea after Pompey's reorganization of the Near East. Aretas III was followed by Malichus I in the year 60 or 59, whose reign unfortunately fell into the tumultuous decades of the mid-1st century BC, as civil wars tore the Republic apart, and he faced further trouble through Rome's conflicts with the Parthian Empire. The civil war that broke out in 48 BC following Julius Caesar's march on Rome saw Malichus side with the Caesarians, as he was convinced by Antipater of Idumea to send cavalry and archers to Caesar's camp to aid his campaign in Alexandria. Though he backed the right horse this round, Caesar's death in March of 44 inaugurated another round of fighting between Mark Antony, the young Octavian Caesar, and any remaining followers of Pompey. Unfortunately, the situation in the Near East was escalated when the Pompeian named Quintus Labienus invited the Parthian king Pacorus I to cross the Euphrates and overrun much of the Levant in 40 BC. Rather than face potential annihilation, Malichus chose to capitulate and aid the Parthian cause. Herod, son of Antipater the Idumean, had fled to Malichus's court seeking shelter from the Parthians due to his Roman leanings, but was refused sanctuary and driven out of Nabatea towards Italy. Little did Malichus know that from this point onwards, the young Herod would become one of the greatest obstacles against the Nabataeans. Once the campaigns of Ventidius Bassus enabled the Romans to drive out the Parthians from the Levant, the loyal Herod was rewarded with the kingship of Judea, while Malichus was fined for his betrayal. The formation of the Second Triumvirate saw the partitioning of the burgeoning empire, and Mark Antony was to control the eastern provinces, while consorting in Alexandria with his new partner and lover, Cleopatra VII. At her request, Cleopatra was granted control over parts of Nabataean Arabia, leased it out to King Herod, who in turn was given the task of charging rent from Malichus. Such a humiliating arrangement infuriated the Nabataean ruler, who eventually refused to comply to these demands whatsoever, and Herod was compelled to go to war with the Nabataeans in 32-31, as Cleopatra sat in the background fanning the flames, hoping that the kings would destroy one another in the conflict. The Judean king suffered severe casualties when he tried to invade the Hauran and was defeated in battle by the army of Malichus, who was aided by one of Cleopatra's generals. Jewish emissaries were sent to broker a peace, but the Nabataeans had them executed and planned a conquest of Judea. This only reinvigorated Herod, who launched another invasion into the Jordan Valley, this time inflicting a severe defeat on one of Malichus's commanders that finally brought that conflict to an end. Now there may have been further violence between both sides, but events on the grand stage took precedent over this regional squabble. Octavian's victory in the Battle of Actium in September of 31 saw Antony and Cleopatra trapped in Alexandria, and in the following year they took their own lives. Malichus appears to have died around the same time, but his son Aretas II was allowed to retain control of the throne, as the newly anointed Augustus Caesar permitted the Nabataeans and Herod to continue their status as client kings subordinate to his rule. Unlike his predecessors, Aretas appears to have been deeply uninterested in doing anything but enjoying the pleasures of the palace, while his minister Salius was the one truly in charge. For the next 2 decades, he pulled the strings while paying fealty to Rome, assisting in a Roman expedition into southern Arabia on the orders of Augustus, more on that later, or attempting to politic with the neighboring Herod. In 9 BC, Salius went to Rome to arbitrate a territorial dispute in front of Augustus, but while visiting Italy, the news broke out that Aretas had died in his absence. This was unfortunate since the minister had been scheming to take control of the Nabataean throne for years, and it came to light that a man named Aeneas had already been crowned as the new king. Aeneas was not Aretas' son, and the odd name may be a consequence of Josephus' transliteration of whatever Nabataean name he possessed, but it seems that this candidate was connected somehow to the royal family, and to reinforce his claim, he took the throne name Aretas. While initially furious over Aretas' coronation without his consent, Augustus eventually gave his blessing to the appointment, much to the dismay of Salius, who was attacked by Aretas as being a parasite and accused as the murderer of Aretas. Salius returned to the court in Petra, still bent on scheming against this new king by orchestrating the deaths of several of Aretas' friends and attempting to assassinate the now elderly Herod. He was brought to Rome in chains, and in 6 BC, Augustus finally had him beheaded for his perfidiousness. With the minister executed, King Herod having died of old age in 4 BC, and operating with the approval of Rome, Aretas IV was secure in his position as king, and over his nearly 50-year career, the Nabataean Kingdom reached its economic and cultural zenith, for which we are owed much of the monumental remains that still can be seen today. Having now covered the history of the Nabataeans until Aretas IV, let us delve deeper into their society and culture, to better give context to their position in the Eastern Mediterranean. The most important and famous Nabataean settlement was the capital city of Petra. For much of the last 1,000 years, the city itself was considered lost to European scholars. Crusaders from the Kingdom of Jerusalem established a castle just to the north of Petra's entrance in the 11th century, as according to tradition, Petra was the final resting place of Aaron, the brother of Moses. But it was conquered by the armies of Saladin by the end of the 12th century, thus severing their access. Muslim rulers occasionally visited the ruins, but given the difficulty of access, it was limited mostly to the Bedouin communities who took up residence there, and in many parts occupy it to the present day. It wasn't until the early 19th century that Europeans rediscovered the ancient city, namely the Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, who in 1812 adopted the disguise of an Arab sheikh on pilgrimage to Aaron's tomb in order to gain access to his location, and took notes that were later published in the 1820s. Outsiders were treated with hostility during these early expeditions, but in the modern day, Petra has become a booming tourist attraction that has seen upwards of 1 million visitors each year. At the time of my visit in April 2025, it was noticeably quiet, which was fortunate for my experience but harder on the local economy of Wadi Musa, the modern town that exists adjacent to the ruins. Though the Greeks and Romans knew the city's name as Petra, the Nabataeans called it Rachmu, which is preserved by their inscriptions and through Josephus's texts. When they still were nomadic, the city was a convenient meeting spot for the tribes due to the natural fortifications and relative ease of access to spring-fed water. Over the next several centuries, it proved to be a lucrative site upon which to permanently occupy as the Nabataean capital, but this required a bit of engineering. One of their most impressive achievements was their ability to maintain a steady water supply in an often hostile environment, prone to droughts and shortages. This was managed by long terracotta pipes and underground cisterns that allowed for water to be channeled without evaporating under the sun, or to be easily concealed from enemies should the city be placed under siege. Rainfall does occur here on occasion, and in the canyon walls of the Suk you can still see the carved recesses that allow excess rainwater to run down the channels to the cisterns. Petra's recessed location can make it prone to flash floods, and the erosion from those events have resulted in the area's exceptionally smooth stone, though the Nabataeans built dams to control this as well. Because of this, the ancient authors universally acknowledge the lands of Petra to be very productive, especially in contrast to the desert surrounding it. Strabo speaks of intensive cultivation of all fruits except for olives, though archaeological surveys have found olive presses in the so-called Little Petra, Sik al-Barid, within the vicinity of the main city. At its peak, it may have contained some 20,000 to 30,000 residents at any one time, though it was also deeply cosmopolitan, hosting visitors and traders from all over the Mediterranean and beyond. The city, as we know it, is largely the product of an enormous building program undertaken during the reign of Aretas IV, a time of general peace and great prosperity for the kingdom. For many decades, the bulk of archaeological surveys and excavations have focused on the site's iconic rock-cut monuments that have earned worldwide admiration, and these date to the period from the late 1st century BC to the late 1st century AD. To enter Petra, visitors must travel from the town of Wadi Musa westwards. Once past the valley where you can see the first signs of Nabataean architecture, you come across the entrance of a narrow gorge known as al-Suk. This winding pathway takes you to the heart of ancient Petra, for you are rewarded with the magnificent sight of al-Khazneh peeking through the crevice at its end. From here, the main road follows northwest, passing by several tombs, the theater, until you finally reach the center of the city itself, marked by a long-running colonnaded street flanked by several large buildings. These include the enormous Great Temple, the smaller Temple of Winged Lions, a series of damaged gates, and the Qasr al-Bint Temple. A map will be made available in the episode transcript, so at least you have proper orientation. Petra served as the royal capital, and at the top of Nabataean society was its king. Until recently, the scholarship has generally believed that the creation of the kingship did not develop until the early 2nd century BC, coinciding with the appearance of Aretas I in the literary and epigraphical record, since there is no evidence of a monarchy in the first encounters of the Antigonids with the Nabataeans. Recent discoveries like the fragments of Postidippus and an Aramaic inscription make it clear that the dynastic kingship was established by at least the early 3rd century, which would remain in place until the last ruler, Rabel II. Our key eyewitness, Athenodorus, provides some commentary on the monarchy's structure and administration, albeit offering an interpretation in a manner that would have been more familiar to him, the Hellenistic courts of Syria and Egypt. Like their Hellenistic counterparts, the king was responsible for leading the army in battle and governing the realm with the assistance of his court. Many Nabataean inscriptions invoke the name of their kings, who were honored with epithets like one who loves his people, or friend of the people. We also have evidence of a royal cult, as an inscription found in the Negev desert attests to the deification of Abodas I, which is backed up by a literary reference from late antiquity. Strabo's account paints the Nabataean kings as rather democratic in function, but also criticizes them as being lazy, uninterested in either engaging in warfare or properly administering. We may dismiss such claims as Eastern stereotyping, given that the Nabataeans successfully waged war against the armies of the Antigonids, Seleucids, Hasmoneans, and Herodians. From the perspective of the Greeks and Romans, Nabataean society was well governed and orderly. After their transition into a more settled lifestyle, an administration was implemented, as we find inscriptions which use Greek administrative titles like eparch, ethnarch, strategos, and more. The most well-documented position is that of chief minister. It seems that the ministers were referred to as brother, though it is not exactly clear whether this was an indication of a blood relation or just a symbolic expression. The power of these men could be quite extensive, and in the case of Salius it could be to the detriment of a feeble ruler. The so-called tomb of Unaishu in Petra is named after its eponymous occupant, who served as the minister of Queen Shakilat II and her son Rabel II from 70 until his death in 76 AD, after which he was interred into the elaborate monument, signifying his important status. Strabo suggests that great drinking parties were held by the king for his court, whereby groups of 13 would be given rich food and alcohol served in a new golden cup for every course, numbering a total of 143 gold cups across 11 courses. And on occasion the wine would be poured by the king himself. Based on the abundance of dining couches found in Petra, we may assume that there was a religious or ceremonial significance to holding these sort of symposiums, as there appears to be an element of gift-giving involved as well. Fitting the model of a more democratic society, Athenodorus claims that the Nabataeans were so harmonious towards one another that the law courts were exclusively foreigners, who engaged in lawsuits with each other or against the Petraeans, but the Nabataeans never battled amongst themselves. Now this is an exaggeration, since inscriptions imply legal disputes over property and other aspects, and the law system appears to be not too different from contemporary societies. Nabataean royal coinage starts officially during the reign of Aretas II, but his son Aretas III was the first king to strike coinage that bore his own portrait, or at least a heavily stylized one. His portrait bears a strong similarity to those minted in the Seleucid Empire, wearing the diadem and having his script in Greek, where he proclaimed himself as a Philhellene. This can be explained as his attempt to assert his legitimacy over former Seleucid territory following his victory over Antiochus XII. Unlike his predecessor, Malichus I shied away from using Greek and began to issue silver coins using the Nabataean script, though strangely limited to his final 3 years as king, likely to fund the war with Herod. By this point, the Nabataeans were a well-established power in the Levant, not as reliant on calling upon Hellenistic motifs to support their credibility, and Malichus's coins would act as the model for all subsequent mintings for the rest of their dynasty's history. These portraits would carry more uniquely Nabataean designs, as the king would be shown with mustaches and hair styled in long waves or ringlets, while continuing to use the Nabataean script instead of Greek or Latin. While we know the names of few Nabataean royal ladies from the literary sources, we are given much more information about them from the numismatic and epigraphic evidence. Aretas IV was the first king to strike coins that carried the portrait and names of both himself and his 2 wives, the queens Hullu and Shakilath, and this practice was followed by Malichus and Rabel II. Virtually every silver coin from Aretas onwards would do so, which might suggest the growing power of Nabataean royal women, or a changing propaganda style emphasizing dynastic unity. Indeed, Nabataean princesses could be used in the building of alliances with neighboring states. King Herod, the most well-known Jewish ruler of classical antiquity, was himself of partial Nabataean descent, his father Antipater of Idumea having married a Nabataean noblewoman, likely a princess, named Cyprus, which, according to Josephus, earned him the king of Arabia's friendship. Herod's son Herod Antipas, the executioner of John the Baptist, was wed to one of Aretas IV's daughters named Physalis, but when he repudiated her in favor of his cousin Herodias, this led Aretas to declare war and destroyed Antipas's army. Following the campaigns of Pompey the Great, the Nabataeans found themselves part of the client kingdom network that dominated the Roman Near East for over 200 years. Kings from Malichus I onwards were allowed to rule with a degree of semi-autonomy, but were compelled to swear fealty to Rome and assist whenever possible, usually in the form of taxation or military support, and stabilize the frontier regions that would otherwise be harder to directly govern. The appointment of new kings needed to be recognized by the emperor, as we saw with the rise of Aretas IV, who barely avoided the wrath of Augustus for seizing the throne without his explicit consent. Military conquest was no longer available for an avenue to acquire glory, so the kings of Nabatea turned to beautifying Petra. King Herod had undertaken a similar building program in Judea, producing magnificent spectacles like his renovations of the Second Temple. It is quite possible that Herod's activities throughout the late 1st century BC directly inspired Aretas' own pursuit of monument building, whether in terms of design choice or giving him that competitive spark to promote Petra as being superior to Jerusalem. Petra was not the only major city of the Nabataeans. Hegra in the Hejaz region of Saudi Arabia and Bostra in southern Syria are two other prominent settlements, to name a few, but it is certainly the most well-represented architecturally. The famous Theatre of Petra is one of its most striking examples, having been built during the early 1st century AD but expanded upon in later years by subsequent rulers. Unlike a typical Greek theatre that is constructed by inserting wood and stone benches into hillsides, the Theatre of Petra is unique because it was carved entirely out of the red sandstone walls from top to bottom and capable of holding around 6,000 audience members. One may observe that the uppermost parts of the theatron was actually carved into pre-existing tombs, which certainly would not have been appreciated by the surviving families of those occupants. Its purpose would likely have been for the performance of plays in Greek literature, as there is evidence that the Nabataeans indulged in it. A wonderfully sculpted sandstone relief in the Jordan Museum shows a portrait of Melpomene, the muse of tragedy, though she unusually is carrying a satyr's mask rather than the mask of a tragedian. Temples are another notable feature of Petra's cityscape, and within its center you can find three large ones: the Qasr al-Bint Firaun, the enormous Great Temple, and the much smaller Temple of Winged Lions. Strabo's account claims that the Nabataeans worship the sun and set their altars on top of their buildings. While the existence of a solar deity is slight, there is evidence that the Nabataeans considered it extremely important to conduct rituals from high vantage points, for the so-called high place of sacrifice in Petra can be found at the very top of an exhaustingly long series of stone steps leading to an open-air altar, where libations and animal sacrifices were performed to the open sky and with a surrounding landscape. The head of the Nabataean pantheon is Dushara, known in Greek as Dusares. Found on the oldest known inscription in Petra, he is considered the patron deity of the city and of the royal family, perhaps adopted from an earlier Elamite god that was worshipped in the region. It is likely that the Qasr al-Bint Firaun, the palace of the pharaoh's daughter, was originally dedicated to Dushara. He came to be interpreted by the Greeks and Romans as Zeus, particularly Zeus Hypsistos, and an enormous limestone sculpture in the Petra Museum shows a blend of Greek and Near Eastern imagery. Many surviving depictions of Nabataean divinities show Greco-Roman influence, but some of the most striking designs continue to reflect their Arabian origins. Known generally as a beetle, these are cult stones or tablets considered sacred and inserted into the niches of temples and other locations. In the Petra Museum can be found a beetle of the Arabian goddess Al-Uzza, a divinity of fertility and fecundity associated with Aphrodite, but the portrait is far less naturalistic and retains more abstract humanoid features: eyes, nose, eyebrows, and feminine lips. Given Petra's cosmopolitan element, it is unsurprising that gods were imported and adopted into their pantheon and artwork. Surviving limestone friezes from the 1st century AD depict Greek deities like Athena, Hermes, Tyche, and some mythological creatures such as sphinxes and medusas, decorating the facades of temples and the Temenos Gate. From Egypt came the goddess Isis, or at least the Hellenized Isis, depicted on statuettes and reliefs. Strabo boldly claims that the burial customs of the Nabataeans were extremely coarse, treating dead bodies with little regard for their sanctity, so that even the bodies of kings were left among the rubbish. This is patently false, for like the Egyptians of the Old Kingdom, the Nabataeans have left behind a plethora of large funerary monuments that remain the most recognizable representations of their culture. There are hundreds of rock-cut tombs found in both Petra and Hegra that range widely in design, containing novel Nabataean features along with those drawn from Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Hellenistic models. The most simplistic are the pylon and step tombs. Pylon tombs are named as such because of the rows of crow steps resembling the pylons of Egyptian temples, while the step tunes adorn their tops with two descending sets of steps facing each other. The latter are sometimes known as the Hejaz type, named after the city which contains the most famous representation of this style, the Qasr al-Farid, the Lonely Castle. These designs tend to be from the earlier period of tomb building, while we find that the larger and more elaborate models that also use Hellenistic patterns come into existence coinciding with the growing wealth of the Nabataean Kingdom. The most iconic, and in some eyes the most impressive, rock-cut monument of the Nabataean civilization is al-Khazneh, the Treasury. This building is what greets travelers as they exit the souk into the heart of Petra, and has become emblematic of the Nabataeans as a whole, named one of the new Seven Wonders, and gaining notoriety through its appearance in films, such as in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. According to tradition, the full name is al-Khazneh al-Pharaon, the Treasury of the Pharaoh, believed to once hold the wealth of the Pharaoh after chasing Moses across the Red Sea, as recounted in the Book of Exodus. Such was its legend that you can still see bullet holes dotting the facade of its center urn, the result of locals and treasure hunters taking potshots at it hoping to gain access. Yet we know that this is just a myth, and the so-called treasury is actually a mausoleum. Built between the late 1st century BC and early 1st century AD, likely during the reign of Aretas IV, this enormous structure measures around 39 meters or 128 feet in height, carved from the top down into the sandstone walls of the city. The bottom half is designed to resemble a temple, adorned with 6 Corinthian columns that guard the entrance into the tomb. On each side of the entranceway, there are 2 larger-than-life reliefs of faceless men with their horses. These are the Dioscuri, the twin horsemen Castor and Pollux, but rather than triumphantly riding their steeds in celebration of victory, they are instead on foot, which was intended to symbolize their role in guiding travelers to the afterlife, a fitting position for a mausoleum. Its interior contains several chambers which at one point housed many bodies, presumably the king and his family members. And while the rooms are bare of design or color, it is highly likely that the walls were richly painted at one point. Returning to the outside facade, the top half contains more columns arranged into 2 broken pediments and a central tholos, the conical-shaped building similar in design to the famous Tholos of Delphi, topped by a stone urn that was believed to have been filled with treasure. This upper half is richly decorated with carved friezes, with imagery like dancing Amazons, perched eagles, fig tree branches, acanthus leaves, and in the center of the tholos is the image of Aphrodite Isis Tyche carrying a cornucopia. Given its ornamentation and layout, it is clearly influenced by late Hellenistic architectural design, with scholars believing that the builders of the monument drew their inspiration from the Ptolemaic palaces of Alexandria in Egypt. It is hard to put into words just how impressive the treasury is, and having seen it in person, it is well worthy of its position as a modern wonder of the world. If there was one thing that the Nabataeans were renowned for by the Greeks and Romans, it was for their role as traders. While this perception is stereotypical, and there is no evidence that the role of merchant was particularly important in their society, the Nabataean Kingdom occupied a unique position that made them a key player in the economic networks of Afro-Eurasia. The most important trade good they dealt in were aromatics, particularly frankincense and myrrh. Derived from trees of the Boswellia and Commiphora genera respectively, these resins were widely desired in the Mediterranean for use in religious rites, medicines, food, and of course for unguents and perfumes. Famously, frankincense and myrrh were included among the gifts to the newborn Jesus by the Magi, and their first mention in Greek literature dates to the poetry of Sappho in the early 6th century. The best supply of both products was restricted to plantations cultivated in southern Arabia, what the Greeks called Arabia Eudaimonia and the Romans Arabia Felix, translating to blessed or lucky Arabia on account of its prodigious wealth. Here the kingdoms of Sabah, Qataban, Hadramaut, and Ma'in all cultivated their own stocks of frankincense and myrrh, though the Sabaeans had a particularly strong hold over the market. It is probably no coincidence that the fabulously wealthy Queen of Sheba, encountered by King Solomon, probably has her name derived from this very same kingdom. By way of caravan and by ship, the Nabataeans would acquire the resins from the Sabaeans and bring them back to ports like Kome or Isla, then Petra. Here they were processed in-house by the local perfume industry or dispersed as is along the land routes to cities like Gaza, a network often popularized as the Incense Road. The profits generated from frankincense and myrrh could be quite high, and it is little wonder then that there were those who looked to seize these lands for themselves. Alexander the Great was already probing the Persian Gulf and sent his naval commanders to sail the Gulf and along the southern coastline of Arabia. He apparently coveted the wealth of Arabia Felix and planned to invade it, but these plans were not fulfilled by him nor his successors after his death in 323. 3 centuries later, the Romans would try to secure control over these goods, for in 25 or 24 BC, the governor of Egypt, Aelius Gallus, led a campaign on behalf of the Emperor Augustus to conquer the Sabaeans and explore the region more thoroughly. With the help of the Nabataean minister Salius, Gallus marched along the Arabian coastline of the Red Sea into Sabah and besieged its capital at Marib, but had to withdraw due to the difficulty of the journey and the casualties they suffered along the way. Strabo accuses Salius as responsible for its failure, believing that he sought to use the Romans against other Arabian competitors and swoop to establish a monopoly once both sides were exhausted, purposefully leading the governor on a brutal march to discourage them from pushing too hard. Another resource the Nabataeans had access to was bitumen. This black viscous material is typically derived from petroleum, but a few rare deposits can be found in nature. Listeners in the United States are probably most familiar with the La Brea tar pits near Los Angeles, but in the ancient world, one prominent site was the Dead Sea. Pitch was used as a waterproofing agent and adhesive, which was important for shipbuilding, construction, and tool making. The Nabataeans fiercely contested anyone attempting to cut into the trade. After the failure of his expedition against the Arabs, Demetrius Poliarchides was tasked by his father to start mining pitch from the Dead Sea, but was attacked by an army of 6,000 Nabataean warriors and forced to abort his operations. Technically, this may be the earliest known example of a battle fought over control of a petroleum resource, over 2,000 years before the first modern oil fields were ever established. Many Nabataeans raised livestock, particularly sheep and oxen, and from what we can tell, horses as well. Yet one of the most important was the one-humped dromedary camel. These creatures are well adapted to desert homes, capable of thriving on thorny plants and scarce water supplies thanks to the stored fat in their characteristic hump. Domesticated thousands of years earlier, they are as important to the Bedouin communities today as they were for the Nabataeans and other ancient Arabs, not only as sources of milk and meat, but also as transportation for the long journeys across the desert. Speaking from personal experience, they are a deeply uncomfortable ride, but they proved to be instrumental for facilitating the trade routes between the Mediterranean, southern Arabia, and the Persian Gulf. Much as they have been a subject of interest to 19th century painters of the Orientalist movement, the camel for the Greeks and Romans became synonymous with the exoticness of the Nabataeans. To Strabo, the number of Nabataean merchants and their load-bearing camels traveling into southern Arabia were so numerous that they scarcely differed from an army. The coins of the praetor Scaurus in 58 BC and those of the Emperor Trajan after 106 AD commemorate their achievements over the Nabataeans with the image of the camel symbolizing Arabia. Beyond this stereotyping, the Nabataeans themselves invoke their image as well. One of the first sights greeting you when you pass through the City of Petra is the badly damaged remains of a sculpture showing a man leading a caravan of camels. Nabataean craftsmen created silver figurines of camel riders, and petroglyphs depicting caravans have been found in multiple places. We often associate the Nabataeans as land-based merchants, but they were quite active in their maritime activities as well. The city of Isla, modern Aqaba, was one of the ports from which Nabataean sailors would set out from into the Gulf of Aqaba and the rest of the Red Sea. They also had a port city known as Kome on the Arabian coastline of the Red Sea, which was a trading hub and subjected merchants to import taxes of 25% on goods, likely instituted by the Romans who wished to protect their Egyptian harbors. Evidently, the increasing emphasis on maritime trade routes in the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, brought about during the Ptolemaic discovery of the monsoon winds in the reign of Ptolemy VIII, saw the gradual bypassing of the older land routes, and eroded the Nabataean monopoly of Arabian goods. In turn, Nabataean piracy became a serious problem, especially in the Gulf of Aqaba, where they would prey upon passing or shipwrecked vessels wherever they could. Famously, the fleet of Cleopatra VII was burned by Nabataean pirates as she was attempting to escape Egypt eastward with her son Caesarion following the defeat at Actium, which ultimately trapped her in Alexandria and led to her suicide. As per their role as traders, it is unsurprising that evidence of their existence can be found in communities all over the Mediterranean. Inscriptions written in Greek by Nabataean Dedicants have been discovered in the Aegean, such as in Kos, Delos, and Miletus. Another inscription found in Tenos in the Cyclades, dating to the 2nd century BC, records the bestowing of a title of proxenos to one Salamenes, a Nabataean of some standing who gained honors for his goodwill towards the Tanians. Given how early this inscription is, it reveals the importance for the Greek and later Roman communities to establish these kind of connections with the Nabataeans in the context of their economic significance. Such enclaves were also to be found in Roman Italy. Underwater excavations of the submerged remains of ancient Puteoli, modern Pozzuoli, in 2023 uncovered the ruins of a temple dedicated to the Nabataean god Dushara. Based on 2 inscriptions found in the vicinity of the region, this temple was built in about 50 BC, and then underwent an enlargement during the reign of Aretas IV. It is apparent then that the Nabataean community living in the city was sizable or influential enough to warrant the construction of such a temple in the first place, and given Dushara's connection to the royal family, it would signify the bond between Rome and Petra. The history of the Nabataean Kingdom would come to an end in 106 AD. After over a century as a client kingdom of the Romans, the death of its last king, Rebel II Soter, during the reign of the Emperor Trajan, was followed up by its annexation. We aren't exactly sure what happened, whether it was an outright conquest by the expansion-happy Trajan, a peaceable transfer of ownership through a will, like the Attalids' bequeathing of Asia Minor, at the implicit threat of the sword, or perhaps something in between. A new province of Arabia Petraea was created, named for the city that captured the imagination of outside observers for centuries, and was to be governed by Roman administrators. Petra retained its status as an important, if slightly diminished, city, for although it was supplanted as the provincial capital in favor of Bostra in the late 2nd century, Trajan would grant Petra the title of metropolis, and so the city remained under Roman control for the next 5 centuries until the Islamic conquests. Interestingly, the latest dated rock-cut tomb can be found tucked away off the trail from the main attractions of Petra, but rather than having a Nabataean occupant, we know that it was built by the son of a Roman named Sextius Florentinus, who was served as governor of Arabia in the reign of Emperor Hadrian and died around 129 AD. For nearly 500 years, the Nabataeans occupied a crucial node within the network of the Eastern Mediterranean, possessing a stable government that continued to impress Greeks and Romans alike, and their monument building has captured the imagination of the millions who have visited Petra over the years. The Nabataeans will periodically make an appearance as we push through the 2nd and 1st centuries, as there are parts of their story that I skimmed over for the sake of brevity. If you're interested in delving more into their history and of pre-Islamic Arabia, I have cultivated an extensive bibliography during my research for this episode. But as a general introduction for Nabataean history, I would recommend G.W. Bowersock's Roman Arabia. If you're looking for a book to help plan your own travels to see the city of Petra, I strongly encourage you to look for a copy of Petra, an Archaeological Guide by Wojciech Makowski, which was incredibly helpful during my preparation stage and as a guidebook while observing the many sights of the park. Thank you all for joining us this year, and I look forward to 2026 being another exciting year for the Hellenistic Age podcast.